Welcome to Look Ahead Radio with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints on the talk station FM 107 AM 1240. In just a few moments, we're going to be joined by Tom Arms with Look Ahead Radio, and we'll be doing viewpoints around the world. Stay with us here on the program, and as always, of course, you're reminded to call in. Tom will be live. The number's 252 area code 247-7282. That's 247-7282. 910 area code 353-4674. That's 353-4674. And that toll-free number 800-818-2255. Via email at viewpoints with an S, viewpointsradio@hotmail.com. Via Facebook at Viewpoints on the Talk Station. Joining us now from London, where he is awake, albeit a little before midnight his time, Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. And with that, Tom, good evening to you.
Good evening, Lockwood.
How is the weather in London?
It's in the 90s.
Whoa.
The low 90s.
Summertime.
Actually, it's probably dipped down to about 85 at night. But it's hot.
Is that unusual?
It is. It's the hottest it's been since 1949, I think.
Well, that's the cycle of climate. Sometimes hot, sometimes cold. How about the rain?
Well, we had a party on Saturday night, and it rained.
Okay.
That's the only day it's rained.
Okay, well, then if you really want rain, you just throw a party. I like that. Let's talk about the events there in Europe and what's happening. We've got so many questions, and I've got to bring up a few issues. As we start the program, has the topic of the candidate's health, particularly that of Hillary Clinton in the United States, had any major publicity or play?
Oh, yes. Yes. That's had a big publicity here. And all the videos of her stumbling as she climbed into a van, they've certainly played big time here. The other issues which have come up with the campaign this week are the decision by the New York State Attorney to investigate the Trump Foundation. And just today, there's been a lot of giggles about Super Trump in Times Square.
Okay. I like that. What about the investigation of the Clinton Foundation as well? Any questions? None.
None. I'm telling you, none. You've been asking me this. Give up.
I'm surprised.
They're not reporting it.
I am surprised. Well, more emails are leaking out from the DNC, and the messages are not all that pretty, as one could expect, particularly in politics, but also when folks think they are, in essence, sharing their information quietly and, one-on-one. But now more emails are still beginning to leak out. Let's talk about the play on the the Clinton campaign, then we'll get to the Trump campaign with the foundation there. Are there any concerns related to Mrs. Clinton's health?
Not concerns. I don't think anyone's expressed concerns. She was reported as having walking pneumonia. I mean, people get pneumonia. People get bad colds. I've had walking pneumonia, and I think it's more a question of bad luck. I think if she got criticized for one thing this week, it was her statement about the deplorable people.
Oh, the basket of deplorables?
The Trump deplorables. And she did get heavily criticized by the European press for that, because if you're running for president, if you want to be president, you don't represent just the people who voted for you. You represent everyone. And so you're basically saying that, those 50% of her Trump supporters, which may be 20% of the population or something, she doesn't like at all, is what she's saying. And that didn't go over very well here. They thought that was a big mistake.
Wow. I mean, we can understand that from the perspective of the Trump campaign, but surprising that the Europeans would find that a questionable description. Okay, and of course, we've got the fact that the big play now is the Super Trump, the poster in Times Square, the digital billboard. That's the
digital billboard, Trump with a big T on his chest flying out over the people of Times Square. Yes, I think that's really tacky.
Tacky? Oh, but all the Supermen folks are really excited. All right, I'll tell you what, we'll take a break on that with our guest, Tom Arms of LookAhead Radio, Viewpoints Around the World.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
This is Tom Arms with the World Report of LookAheadNews.com for the week beginning the 19th of September. LookAhead broadcasts tomorrow's news today so that you can plan to participate. Immigration, refugees, and how to cope with the world's biggest recorded movement of people will be discussed when world leaders meet at the UN headquarters next week. On Monday, Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon hosts a summit on coping with mass immigration, and the following day, President Barack Obama will host another meeting to call for increased spending and agreed quotas for refugees. Also on Monday, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development publishes its Immigration Migration Outlook for 2016. Refugees will not be the only item on the agenda as world leaders gather for the start of the next UN General Assembly. New Zealand Prime Minister John Key chairs a meeting on the Syrian civil war, cause of much of the refugee problem. And the foreign ministers of India, Japan, Germany and Brazil meet to discuss their campaign to gain permanent membership of the UN Security Council. Terrorism will be the main issue when Pope Francis on Friday visits Scotland's oldest university, St Andrews, to sign an extremist charter aimed at stopping the recruitment of young people to extremist radical views. The following day, he is back at the Vatican to console the families of the victims of the Nice terrorist attack. And early in the week, he joins with leaders of the Jewish, Buddhist and Muslim faiths for the World Day of Prayer. And finally, if you fancy a stroll around one of the world's most beautiful cities, then head to Paris on Sunday, when cars will be banned from the city centre. And that was next week's News Today from LookAheadNews.com, so that you can plan to participate in the world around you. Stay tuned after this message for the expanded Look Ahead World Analysis.
They say the best things in life are free. So, hey, why are we paying so much for our basic information and entertainment needs? The average cable TV bill has more than doubled in the last 10 years. The price of movie tickets keeps going up. So, exactly what is free today anyway? Well, you're listening to it. Local radio. Support the advertisers that support this radio station. And keep listening. We won't send you a bill. There are still some things you just shouldn't have to pay for.
This is Tom Arms of LookAheadNews.com's expanded world analysis for the week beginning the 19th of September. Look Ahead broadcasts tomorrow's news today so that you can plan to participate. The number of forcibly displaced people around the world is the highest since records began. 65.3 million, or nearly 1% of the world's population. Half are children. 2 summits will be held to discuss the plight of refugees. The first on Monday will be hosted by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, and the second on Tuesday by President Obama. Obama will press leaders to increase refugee funding from $10 to $15 billion a year and urge them to welcome more displaced people. He's expected to promise that America will take another 65,000 Syrian refugees. The summits coincide with the publication of the annual Migration Outlook by the Paris-based OECD. The mounting refugee problem will also be discussed at the 3-day annual session of the Clinton Global Initiative, which includes Nobel laureates and CEOs of multinationals as well as politicians. One of the biggest causes of the refugee crisis is the Syrian civil war. And next Wednesday, New Zealand Prime Minister John Key hosts a UN meeting to discuss progress towards a peaceful solution. World leaders are in New York for the start of the 2016 session of the UN General Assembly. 2 other items on the autumn agenda are the election of a new Secretary-General to replace the retiring Ban Ki-moon, and possible changes to the structure of the Security Council. Next week, the foreign ministers of Japan, Germany, India and Brazil meet in the General Assembly fringes to discuss tactics for securing permanent membership status for their countries. Pope Francis next week focuses his efforts on combating world terrorism. On Tuesday, he's off to Assisi to meet Jewish, Muslim and Buddhist representatives for the World Day of Prayer for Peace. The Italian President, Sergio Mattarella, is also attending the event. On Friday, the Pope is flying to Scotland's oldest university, St Andrews, to join other religious leaders to sign a charter to combat religious extremism and radicalisation. The 10-point charter has been drawn up by the university's professor of divinity, Mario Aguilar, and stresses the common humanity of all the world's major religions. The following day, Pope Francis is back in Rome to console the families of the 84 people who died in the Nice terrorist attack in July. On the election front, there are parliamentary elections in Russia, but don't expect major changes, as President Putin has managed to keep opposition politicians off the ballot or undermine their campaigns in the state-controlled press. There are also legislative elections in Jordan, where the Muslim Brotherhood is expected to make big gains, but power will remain firmly in the hands of King Abdullah II. And that was next week's News Today from LookAheadNews.com, so that you can plan to participate in the world around you. Stay tuned for Viewpoints Around the World with myself and Lockwood Phillips.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. And I've got to make mention, Tom, I see that we've gotten some questions. You've got a question from listener in Gambia in Africa, and we've got another one from London. We'll get to those issues a little later on in the program. Of course, Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio, and Tom stays with us. Tom, we've got a caller here locally I'm going to get on. Just want to advise folks, we're going to chat more about the Trump campaign, the issue of immigration, and the influence and impact. I want to talk to you about that on the world events, particularly there in London, but also some interesting stories about Hungary. But first, Tom, we've got a caller in Hubert. Mike, good evening. Mike, welcome.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I had a question for Ron. I heard reports of England building a wall for, in the immigration situation, and I haven't researched it. I have heard about it on talk radio, and I just wanted to get his take on that.
All right, Mike, thanks very much for your call on that one. Appreciate that.
No, thanks very much indeed, Mike. Yes, there is a refugee camp with about 7,000 refugees in France at Calais, which is the city just on the, or town just on the other side of the English Channel from England. Mm-hmm. And this has about 7,000 refugees in it. They're living in deplorable conditions. It's called the jungle. And these refugees have been trying to basically hide on articulated trucks, on trucks that are going onto the ferries and into the Channel Tunnel on trains, basically sort of hanging on to the bottom of the undercarriages of the trucks, trying to sneak into the back of the trucks, trying to persuade drivers and jumping into the back of cars and things like that, to try and gain access into Britain. And what they've done is they've built a fence along the road between the camp and the road that leads to the ferry port.
But who's built that?
What they were doing is they were running up from the camp across the road into the road and jumping on these trucks.
Who's building the wall, though?
The British are building the wall. The
Really?
British are building. They are building the fence, and they're paying, I think, £7 million for it.
This plays well into the conversation. Let's talk about the immigration, the fact that immigration, of course, here in this country is still a hot topic. Announcement recently by President Obama that even more opportunities are going to be made available to folks from the Middle East, many of them from Syria. Some very great questions on the part of the voters and the residents of the U.S. How much of that is impacting the conversation in Europe, particularly in Europe, but also let's throw in the U.K. as well, Tom?
Well, as you know, immigration was a major issue in the Brexit campaign. And there's a big summit meeting this week at which they're going to be discussing of EU heads of government in Bratislava. They'll be discussing Brexit. They will also be discussing the fact that countries like Hungary will not allow any refugees in and have set up razor wire fences along the border. There have even been reports that the Prime Minister, President Viktor Orban, is talking about a shoot-to-kill policy to prevent refugees. And the Central European governments is a group called Visegrad 4, or the Visegrad Group. which comprises Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Slovak Republic, and Poland, have all said that they don't want to take any refugees. There's going to be a big summit meeting, 2 big summit meetings next week in New York. One of them hosted by Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, and the other by President Obama. And basically to discuss the problem of refugees. There are more refugees in the world today than there ever have been in the history of the world.
No, that begs the issue.
65.3 million displaced people, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees.
Okay, that begs the issue. What is the cause of this?
The cause of it is there's wars, and not just in Syria, but also in Afghanistan, Libya, Ethiopia, Sudan, parts of northern Nigeria. A lot of people have been displaced by Boko Haram. Somalia. All these people have been displaced, and they are heading for Europe. About 75% of the refugees that have been displaced are heading for Europe.
The problem is, Tom, that you've got players in the Middle East who have, quite frankly, the observations, I'm going to make this as a personal observation, but I think this is true for many of us, who see this as a game to them. In Syria particularly, you need a scorecard to keep up with who's playing and on whose side the various groups are serving. And we have Russia. Is Russia feeling any impact from these refugees?
No, they're not taking any refugees that I know of. Nobody wants to go to Russia. It's not a country which people want to go to. It's not a particularly free country. It doesn't have a good economy. It's very cold. No, they don't want to go to Russia.
Okay, what is the future? Because things are not improving in the Middle East in any way, shape, or form. So what is the future? Is this part of the discussion?
Well,
or is it
that is what's going to be discussed in New York next week. They're going to try and work out a strategy. And yes, Obama is talking about, it was a suggestion, I think, from the Brookings Institution, which he's taken on board, to take on at least another 65,000 refugees from Syria in particular, and
is this not just a Band-Aid solution to a deeper problem?
I couldn't agree with you more. The problem, and they are trying to address it, but at the same time they have to apply the Band-Aid. So there's a short-term and a long-term solution, and the long-term solution has to be to prevent people by or create conditions under which they won't want to migrate, create jobs, create trade and investment in places like sub-Saharan Africa and also in the Middle East, and also to prevent wars from happening. Because one of the reasons why you had the war was because of lack of political freedoms, lack of economic opportunity. Those are the things which spark off the Arab Spring in 2011.
Well, you have to have stability and peace in order to have trade. Very quickly, the impact on Hungary with their efforts to stop any further refugee entry. What impact will that have on Hungary's relationship with the EU?
Well, the foreign minister of Luxembourg this week, a chap called Asselborn, has said that Hungary should be excluded because it is... When you join the EU, you sign up to basic freedoms, and one is the right to give asylum to people.
We're going to get back to that in just a moment with Tom Arms here on Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. Stay with us.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Quick, what do these sounds have in common? These are the sounds of geography. Geography helps us understand connections between people and places. But our kids aren't getting enough of it. Half can't locate Japan or India, and 20% can't even find the Pacific Ocean. So we created MyWonderfulWorld.org to give kids the power of global knowledge. Go to MyWonderfulWorld.org to learn more. It's a wonderful world.
We now return to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints around the world with your co-host, as a matter of fact, Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. And of course, Look Ahead Radio heard on our station, but around the nation. And as a matter of fact, we've had some questions from Gambia, Africa, and also from London. And we're going to get to those in a few minutes. I want to talk about the EU for a few more moments, if we could. I read an interesting story that Marine Le Pen has, quote, according to the London Express, has dealt a crippling blow to the European Union by promising she will hold a referendum to decide whether France remains in the Union if she becomes president. Also, apparently, the Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, after branding his State of the Union speech of MEPs, that's European parliaments, in Strasbourg, he's described them as being insipid. What's going on with the EU?
Well, first of all, that's old news about Jean-Marie Le Pen. She said that ages ago, which is typical of the Daily Express. They're always behind on the news. Mm-hmm. Right. And there was a Jean-Claude Juncker he's the Commission president. Gave a State of the Union address to the European Parliament today. That basically, it was meant to set the agenda for the Bratislava summit, which is going to be held this weekend. Mm-hmm. And the main issues, of course, are Brexit, but also is the issues of immigration, back to immigration again. And Jean-Claude Juncker wants to set up a European army, and he wants to move quickly to establish a headquarters because he says that a European army is needed because Europe cannot be taken seriously if it doesn't have an army, and that it must work very carefully on political union. It must be more responsive, he says, to the concerns of the member states, that they have to learn their lesson from Britain's withdrawal, that they were not responsive enough to Britain's needs. Now, at the same time, he calls for closer and closer political union. This has been echoed earlier in the week by a chap called Mario Draghi, an Italian who also happens to be the head of the European Central Bank. The need to be more responsive to member states and not to impose things by Brussels on the member states.
Let me interrupt you here for a moment. You said something that is really quite stunning. One, a European army. I have to ask for two quick observations on this one, both of them from the UK's opinion. I don't see the UK ever being supportive of that. And what about NATO? This whole concept. Go ahead.
I know. It really deserves a discussion on its own. And the European army, you're absolutely right. And Britain has always been opposed to a European army. I think I mentioned this in previous discussions. And Britain has been a brake on the creation of a European army. But a number of the European countries, in particular Germany and the East European countries, and I think the Dutch, and to a certain degree, a lesser degree perhaps, the French, would like to have a European army because they believe it is important to have a European army to create political cohesion and make Europe a real force in the world. Now, this would put strains on the transatlantic alliance because it sets up a completely different command structure for half of NATO, if you like.
Right.
America funds roughly half of NATO, and the other half is funded by the European countries and the UK. And the UK has always sat between Europe and America. And it has fought against too much European integration on the defense side because it wants to make certain that the United States remains tied to the defense of Europe. And the concern is that if a European army and a European army headquarters is created, that it will become too independent of the United States. The United States will lose interest in NATO. NATO will fall apart. The transatlantic alliance suffers, and so forth and so on. Yes, it is a concern.
It's an amazing story, one that we hear very little about here in the States. And of course, I can say that very many people here listening to this program are hearing it for the first time. Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. Tom, several questions have to be asked in the midst of this, and then I will move on to other items. If there is a European army, the first question is to prepare against what other opponent? Need that be Russia? And could it be Turkey? And then the next question is, if that were to happen, how would Germany and the other countries accept this? Is it acceptable to other countries there in Europe?
It's still in the early stages, but certainly the major opponent is conceived to be Russia.
Wow.
But also there is concern that there needs to be greater integration of the European navies to protect European borders from the refugees crossing the Mediterranean, not only from Turkey, but also from the Lebanon, from Libya, from Egypt, from Morocco, all of North Africa. So they, that is, and they are already cooperating on that.
I can imagine that the United Kingdom is kind of smirking, knowing that they made the decision to get out of the EU.
No, not at all.
Really?
If we're talking about the European army, no, not at all. Because they are as dependent upon the transatlantic alliance for their defense as is the rest of Europe. I mean, you're not going to have much of a transatlantic alliance if it's just the UK and the US.
Well, I have to say that without the UK's and Great Britain's participation, a European army, at least my observation, is that it would be a hollow force. All right, let's move on to other items, though, associated with Brexit and the impact of the economy in Europe very quickly. And I want to move to issues associated with the oil glut as well. What is now happening in the UK related to the decision to exit the European Union, and how is this influencing the economies in the countries there in the mainland, on the continent?
Well, at the moment, there's not a great deal of economic repercussions. Unemployment is actually down. It dropped. I think 30,000 or 360,000. I can't remember. I know there's a big difference between the two, but I can't remember the exact figure. But it dropped in July, the month following the Brexit vote. Those are the latest statistics that came out today. That was a surprise. Everyone expected unemployment to go up a bit. Unemployment now is better than full employment. It is at 4.9%. In the case of Europe, well, they're still worried about Brexit. They're trying to, the meeting that's going to be held in Bratislava this week, they're going to try and work on the basic guidelines for a strategy for negotiations. The British are doing the same. It's like a big pre-fight debate at the moment. They haven't even started circling each other's in the ring. They're still getting ready for the fight, trying to get in shape. And the fight doesn't start until Article 50 is invoked.
Okay, and of course that is anticipated to be another year from now?
I wouldn't say it will be in 2017. I don't know exactly when. I don't think Theresa May even knows when. She needs to get all her ducks in a row, so to speak. She needs to recruit lots of negotiators. They only have 5 trade negotiators in Britain because all trade negotiations had been done through the EU. The EU, the Commission, has 500. So they've got to go out and recruit retired diplomats, retired lawyers. They've got to recruit people from America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand to handle their trade negotiations for them. And they've got to get them in as quickly as possible. And they've got to start talking to them now. They are talking to them now. They're trying to get them ready, briefing them on what the likely positions to be. But we won't know what those positions are for some time.
All right, we're going to get back right after this break with 2 questions that were sent in earlier this week. One from Gambia, Africa, and the other from London. And I also want to ask you about the impact of, close air quotes here, the oil glut. Is there really an oil glut? We'll find out in just a moment with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio here on Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms and Lockwood Phillips.
Look Ahead Radio will return in just a moment.
Observations of an Expat by Tom Arms. The figures are staggering. 65.3 million are currently forcibly displaced from their homes. Half of them are children. That figure from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees is the highest since records began and has doubled over the past 10 years. Refugees, asylum seekers and economic migrants are one of the greatest threats, if not the greatest threat, to world stability. On Monday and Tuesday, there are two New York summits to address the crisis. The first is chaired by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, and the second by President Obama. Neither one will come up with a solution. The refugee crisis is a massive humanitarian problem. Television pictures of babies drowning in the Med, struggling to survive in a Greek refugee camp, or marching thousands of miles to reach sanctuary tug at our heartstrings and appeal to our basic humanity. But that emotion conflicts with fear of growing terrorism, cultural pollution, and loss of national identity. So far, Europe has borne the brunt of the refugee crisis. This is not surprising, since 3/4 of the refugees come from Africa and the Middle East, which shares the Mediterranean lake with prosperous Europe. War, famine, and disease has forced them out of their homes. They've crossed deserts and seas and suffered torture and rape. Most of them are being contained in refugee camps in appalling conditions. But these camps are flimsy dams holding back a tsunami of increasingly desperate people. Obama, Ban Ki-moon, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel want their fellow world leaders to increase spending on the refugee problem by a third, from $10 to $15 billion, and to spread the load of finding homes across the globe. The one-third increase is far from generous. It provides an income of $230 a year for each refugee. That's the same as the per capita income of Malawi, the world's poorest country. As for the threat of terrorism, well, according to Europol, less than 2% of all of the EU's terrorist incidents are jihadist-inspired. The overwhelming majority are instigated by separatist organizations which have plagued the continent for centuries. Europol also estimates that 0.0003% of asylum seekers are disguised terrorists. In the U.S., between 9/11 and January 2015, 37 people died at the hands of Islamic terrorists, compared to 190,000 run-of-the-mill murderers over the same period. Professor Charles Kurzman at the University of North Carolina has called Islamic terrorism a minuscule threat to public safety. That is not, however, the public perception. Their concerns are stoked by politicians who prey on the underlying fears of voters and pander to them with lies, distortions, and half-truths. Voters in the safe, secure West fear threatened not only by terrorists, but also by cultural pollution, loss of national identity, and a loss of economic security. Forget the facts. The deep-seated fears are too ingrained in national and personal psyches to be dismissed with mere facts. This political fact is a reality which the humanitarian leaders have to address. Liberal politicians are learning that they ignore this new looking-glass reality at their peril. Example 1. Britain's Brexit vote, in which fear of immigrants triumphed over common sense. Example 2. The rise of Trump on the back of his proposed wall, block on Muslims, and deportation of Latinos. Example 3. The ridiculous shoot-in-the-foot French burkini ban. Example 4. A Hungarian fence topped with razor wire and guarded by 10,000 armed police and soldiers to block Muslim refugees. World leaders gathered in New York cannot allow tens of millions to suffer. But neither can they turn their back on the concerns of a significant proportion of the populations they purport to represent. Somehow, they must find a way to balance the hope for millions against the fear of millions.
Welcome back to Look Ahead Radio. Here is Lockwood Phillips.
Viewpoints Around the World with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio. And Tom, we've got some calls. We've got some folks who have asked some questions. But before we do that, I want to go very quickly to the issue of the oil glut and the impact this is maybe having on the European economy. anything of significance? Maybe improving it?
No, it's not. It's not having a direct impact, I don't think. But the International Energy Agency this week issued a report saying that you can expect prices to remain low, around $40 to $50 a barrel, that there will be a glut well into 2017, probably all the way through 2017. So another 18 months or so of low oil prices. And the reason is severalfold. Everyone is absolutely pumping as much oil as they can. Iran has come on full stream. Everyone is pumping oil because they've got to try and make some money.
But this is going to impact both Russia and Iran eventually because they're so dependent upon oil. And, of course, it should influence, I would think, the Arab Emirates as well. Before we go to the several questions that have been asked by email, is there some concern as to the inability of these countries to meet their internal needs if the current spate of oil glut continues?
Well, of course, Russia's having problems. Its economy is declining. Mm-hmm. It's shrinking at about 6% a year at the moment. So, yeah, it's having problems. I think Iran was starting from such a low base that any oil it sells is going to be good. So, no, I don't think it's going to affect Iran. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, they have huge sovereign wealth funds that they can fall back on. Countries in Africa or South America, Venezuela, as we know, is in complete, it's a basket case at the moment. Mm-hmm. Nigeria is going down the tubes. So is Angola. Countries like Libya, obviously, they have their own civil war. But, you know, if they had some money coming in from oil, that would help to resolve the political problems there. So in some cases, yes. In other cases, no.
This is a great segue into a question that was written in from the chairman and CEO of Afro Radio Network in Gambia, noting he is delighted to hear the program. About the analysis of world affairs, he writes, Africa...
What's his name?
Roque Silva Morgado. I'm not sure if it's Roque or Roque Silva Morgado. And he writes, about the analysis of world affairs in Africa in particular, let me say I partly agree with money as one of the motivating factors of permanence and power in Africa politically, but partly it is a matter of greed of power. The decline in oil prices, may we see some changes? May this result in your theories about African leadership?
Yes, well, of course. I mean, it's going to put a lot of pressure on the leaders in, as I said, in particular Nigeria and Angola, but also in South Sudan where they have oil and where there's a civil war going on at the moment. I think what Roque is also saying is that, you know, it's not just the money. They like to have power. Mm-hmm. They like to have power. And as Kissinger once said, you know, power is the greatest aphrodisiac.
It is, but money is a means to reaching that power.
And vice versa. Power is a means of reaching the money.
Katie in London writes, in UK politics, we have a first past the post system, which is often deemed unfair, particularly by the Liberal Democrat Party, who have campaigned for electoral reform for many years. What is the system used in U.S. politics and all parties generally accepting of the system? First off, what is first past the post system? What is
Simple
that?
Majority is what it is.
Okay.
And in other European countries, they have what's called proportional vote system, or an alternative vote system.
Okay, well, it's predominantly, well, we're a Democrat republic, Katie, but it is predominantly a simple majority as well. Tom, thank you very much for being with us this evening. And I just want to make mention of the fact that we're getting posts now, and we've been having people listening to us on the stream as well. That's with Tom Arms of Look Ahead Radio, here with viewpoints around the world.
Look Ahead Radio is a production of the Talk Station.